I'm going to share my screen and start the presentation now. The title of this presentation is Building a Strong TRIO Talent Search Program. And we're going to cover a lot of the basics of what a TRIO program looks like, the structure of it. And within that context, you'll be able to understand what goes into your grant application. So I'm Heath Alexander, and I'm currently the Senior Director of Grants and Program Evaluation at Study Smart Tutors. And as luck would have it, I'm also a former Talent Search student. So I'm a TRIO alum. I participated in Talent Search at Southwestern Michigan College in Dowagiac, Michigan. And I became the first in my family to attend college and the only person in my family to go on to get a bachelor's degree and a master's degree as well. When I attended college, I became a summer camp counselor for Upward Bound, and that's when I started my my love for being a professional, working in these programs. I worked as an Upward Bound and Upward Bound Math Science summer counselor through undergrad, and when I graduated, I became an Upward Bound teacher and coordinator. I got my degree in biology and chemistry and my teacher certification. And so I also taught biology and chemistry classes during the UB and UBMS summer programs as well. Eventually, after a couple of years, worked my way up to become the director of Upward Bound and spent about 11 years working for Upward Bound in total. At my institution, we also had McNair, SSS, Talent Search. And since I left the Grand Valley State University, my alma mater, I moved here to Washington, D.C. to work at the Council for Opportunity in Education, or better known as COE to most of you. And I worked at COE for several years on the government relations team. And I also was a faculty member of the grant proposal writing workshop teams and helped critique grant applications. And more importantly, for about 5 years, I ran the national appeal process at COE. So what that meant was if institutions were unsuccessful in getting their grant application, they would send me their grants and their readers' comments. And my job was to find errors that the readers made in scoring the application so that we could write appeal letters to the department. So I say all of that background to say, I understand these programs really well from a student perspective, from a part-time undergrad employee perspective, from coordinator, director, and also from the perspective of a national lens on how these grants are written, how they're scored, and how the Department of Ed, ultimately, the readers will score them and how we appeal those grants as well. So I have an extensive background in TRIO specifically, and also in grant writing. I know that we have various people on this in this webinar from all, the entire spectrum of TRIO. Some of you are brand new, some of you are current coordinators, some of you are new directors. And I know I've seen some people on the call already that have been in TRIO for a really long time, probably as long as I've been in TRIO as well. So we have a pretty broad spectrum of people in the room. I want to start with the RFP process because things have changed dramatically as of this past year. Normally what happens is the Department of Education will release a draft of we call it RFP, or request for proposals. Other people call it NIA or FOA. There's all different kinds of ways that we call these, like instructions for how you're going to write your grant. In TRIO, we pretty much just call it an RFP, or request for proposals. And that usually kicks off the entire grant cycle of when the grant submission will be due. And normally the Department of Ed will give a 30-day comment period on the draft. And those comments will come in from our community, from COE, from our regions, our board members. And then the Department of Ed, if they decide to make any changes, will release a final RFP. And then ultimately we'll have a due date that is typically between 30 and 60 days after the final RFP comes out. This is the normal process. And this is what we would typically expect the timeline to look like. And from the draft until the due date is typically about 120 to 180 days from when the draft is released to the 30-day comment period to the final RFP being released to the due date. I use the language carefully to say that's what we typically see, because this last year in 2024, with the Student Support Services grant competition, we did not see any of this happen for the first time in as long as I can remember. The Department of Ed did not give a draft. They did not give a 30-day comment period. They simply just said, here's the RFP. We're launching it. But one of the positive changes that came out of that was that they did give us 75 days to write it, which is also not typical. We typically will get 30 to 60 days at the most. So while they did skip this draft and 30-day comment period, they did give us an extended amount of time to write the grant. Now, so what did that mean for the due date? Well, that also drastically changed the due date for Student Support Services. And the best guess we have right now is that they're going to follow some similar timeline as they did this year for SSS. That is not confirmed. We've not been told that directly. We don't know that for sure, but that's what we need to be prepared for and need to expect. What that means is this year, Student Support Services was due July 15th. In the past, the Student Support Services grants were not due until the following January or even February, which means that the SSS grants were due 8 to 10 months earlier than they normally are due. If we're to expect the same thing for Talent Search, we can expect these grants to be due sometime between May and probably July of 2025. I did put December of 2025 because if they go back to their typical cycle, it may not likely be due until the fall, maybe sometime in December or even January, February of 2026. That's when it used to be due. As you can see on this slide, in 2016 and in 2021, both of those grants were due in February of the following year. So that would put us in February of 2026 if they followed the old way. Now, the reason why I put the extended timeline between May and December is because we're also running into an election year. So depending on who wins the election, let's say past President Trump wins again and becomes the new president, it's very likely we'll see an appointment of a new Secretary of Education, which could delay things quite a bit. Other people who work in the Department of Education may also opt to not stick around for a new administration as well. And so that could even further delay things, as you know, in addition. If Vice President Harris wins, we likely won't see as much of a delay. Although I am hearing that it's likely that we'll get a new Secretary of Education as well, even with the Harris administration, but it's less likely to delay things. But the election certainly does muddy the waters a little bit this year as compared to, you know, the SSS competition. And so we really do not know when this grant will be due. However, we should start now, right? We should start preparing now. In the event that it is due in May or June or July of next year of 2025. So I want you to prepare for all scenarios, and preparing for those scenarios means that you want to secure your target schools, especially if you're writing as a new applicant, but also as an existing applicant. You may choose to add new schools. You may choose to take some schools out of your old application, but you definitely want to start and make sure you're securing the commitments from the target schools that you're opting to put in your grant, and start getting secured letters from them and start to mine some of the data that you're going to need for the grant. I would recommend starting that now. We can expect that there will likely be competitive preference priorities and possibly a quality of project design. However, in the 2021 competition, the quality of project design was an actual competitive preference priority as opposed to a new section. And so the quality of project design includes the logic model and the rationale behind the design of the logic model. In some TRIO programs, that's in the actual narrative. In other programs, it shows up in the competitive preference priorities. But you should expect that there will be some kind of quality of project design demonstrating a rationale with a logic model somewhere in the application. Again, we had it in 2021 as a competitive preference priority number 3. One of the questions that we get often is, how can we begin to write a grant now if we don't have the RFP or the instructions, or we don't know what the due date is if you're a new applicant or you're a new director and you've not written these grants before, that's a logical question. How do we know what we're going to be able to write? Well, the answer is that the selection criteria for the TRIO programs is already outlined in federal regulations. So if we go to the federal regulation website and we click on the talent search regulations, we know that, I'm sorry, this is the law. If we go to the regulatory language for these programs, the Code of Federal Regulations, which is 643, and we look under 643.21, what selection criteria does the secretary use? When you click on this, it will explain to you how many points you get and all of the details of the selection criteria. So here's your needs section built out here. Your objectives come next, your plan of operation here. So the regulations will tell you what selection criteria the department must use in scoring these applications. So because of this, we can start now with outlining what the details of this will be, knowing that about 90% of what's going to go into your grant narrative is already known because it's outlined in federal regulation. They cannot take things out of the federal regulation selection criteria because it is regulatory language, but they can add new criteria. They are allowed to add new sections, and of course the competitive preference priorities. They can add absolute priorities. They can add all kinds of optional priorities. So they can add stuff to the grant, but this general selection criteria is the same as it was in 2021. There has been no change to the Higher Education Act since 2008. The Higher Education Act is the law that governs the TRIO programs, and the regulations are written to address what the law says. And so until the Higher Education Act is reauthorized and the legislation is changed, the regulations are less likely to change. And so these regulations have not been changed since 2010. It took about 2 years after the reauthorization in 2008 to finalize these regulations that were published in 2010. And so they've not been changed in those 14 years since. And so we can expect the selection criteria to be identical to what it was in 2021. And with that, we also, I can send this to you if you all would like, but I also have the final RFP instruction package from 2021. You can see here it was due February 26th of 2021. You can also get it from the Department of Ed webpage. I put a link to the webpage in my presentation, but basically, if you go to the Department of Ed website under talent search, they actually have a new apply button. I noticed this is kind of new to their page, but they do have a link to the past notice for inviting applicants and Federal Register notice here. So you can get this information from their website, but I could also email it to you. So that answers the question about how can we write now? How can we start writing for this grant before it's published? Is because we already know through regulation what goes into it. All right. In the chat box, can you all list how many talent search grants each institution may write for? Let me see answers in the Q&A or the chat box. How many talent search grants do you think you can write for? Are you all able to write in the chat box?
Sorry, Heath. It's now Kiana, but we're in a bigger room, so we don't have the chat box available. But if folks want to just shout out some numbers.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Anyone? Someone said 2.
Okay, good guess. Anybody, anyone else on the webinar want to give a guess?
Someone said that they have 3 grants, so they're guessing 3.
So that's more, that's more than 2 for sure.
As many as you want.
Yeah, yeah. The answer is as many as you want. However, the regulatory language does say that in order to write additional talent search grant, you must choose a different target area and different target schools. So as long as you're serving a different target area, you can write for a different talent search grant in each area, or and you can carve out your area to include different target schools than your other grants. So really, it's unlimited based on your geographic location. So if I'm in New York City, or I'm in, Los Angeles, or I'm in, Miami or Houston or Dallas or some big city, Chicago, you could write a lot of them. If I'm in a very rural location, and I'm already spread out hundreds of miles just with the 10 schools I'm working in, it makes it very hard for you to write more than one grant. So geography definitely plays a role into it, but yeah, you can write as many talent search grants as you have different target areas and target schools to write for. Who's eligible to apply for talent search? You can apply as an institution of higher education. You can apply as a secondary school. You can apply for talent search as a nonprofit agency. And you can also apply in a combination of any of those different groups. So yeah, if you happen to be in an area where there are other higher ed agencies or secondary schools and nonprofits, you definitely want to bring them along too and see if they're interested in applying for grants if you're not able to apply for more than what you have. The selection criteria, as I mentioned, is outlined in 643.21, and the 7 sections that we'll find in that regulatory language include the needs section, objectives, the plan of operation, applicant and community support, quality of personnel, budget, and evaluation. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail about each of those sections today. What's typically not in regulation, but we can expect to have is, again, I'm interchanging the quality of project design as the language around the demonstrates a rationale with the logic model. I'm just calling it quality of project design because that's what it's been called in other grants. And then we'll also likely have competitive preference priorities. So what are the competitive preference priorities, and why do we not know what they are going to be? Well, competitive preference priorities are the priorities that the Secretary of the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Ed, the sitting secretary will publish a list of national priorities for education. Sometimes it's a list of 20 or more priorities. And any grant competition that goes out from the Department of Education, the secretary can take from that list of priorities and insert them into any grant competition. So the Department of Ed does a pretty good job of aligning those priorities with the actual programs that they're putting them into. Sometimes there's some gray areas, sometimes there's a bit of confusion, but for the most part, I think they've done a pretty decent job of aligning those things together. But the reason we don't know what the competitive preference priorities will be is because the secretary can choose among any of their priorities to place into talent search. And also, we may have a different Secretary of Education this time next year. We may have a different Secretary of Education by the time the RFP comes out. They may have a new list of priorities for the country. And so we just cannot predict those at the moment. And so I would not get worried about them. I wouldn't stress about them. I wouldn't try to prognosticate and figure out what they're going to be. Just wait till they come out. You've got plenty to work on right now while we're waiting for those, those instructions to come out and what those competitive preference priorities will be. We do know from Upward Bound, and we do know from the recent Gear Up competition, we do know what some of the priorities likely would be if we have the same secretary and if they choose the same priorities. But again, it's not really worth stressing out at the moment. If you take care of the other items that we do know, that will leave you enough time once the RFP is published to be able to respond to these competitive preference priorities. If there's an absolute priority, we all must apply for it. If there's an invitational priority, it will be optional, and you do not have to apply for it, and you don't get any more points for them. If there are competitive preference priorities, which there most likely will be, you'll notice that in the notice for inviting applications, you'll notice from the Federal Register and from the instructions that they call the competitive preference priorities optional as well. But please write this, if you're taking notes today, write this down in your notes. They are not optional. While they say they're optional, there are points attached to them. Typically anywhere from 3 to 8, maybe even 10 points sometimes for these competitive preference priorities. If you do not write for them, even though they're listed as optional, you cannot earn those points, and therefore you will almost never get funded, because you're not writing for points that everyone else is writing for, and you're already at an extreme disadvantage if you don't write those competitive preference priorities. So anytime anything has any point value attached to it, even if it says optional, you must write for them. Okay, hopefully that was clear. I want to use very strong language there because it's very, very important that you don't leave any points on the table. All right. Again, you all are unmuted. So if you have any questions, please feel free to stop me in the middle of this. Because it's webinar style, I'm going to spend a lot more time talking, but I would certainly love to engage in conversation and Q&A as well. So the first and most important section of the entire grant is the needs section. And the needs section is where you're going to outline all the data points that set the stage for why this grant is needed in your community, right? It sounds self-explanatory, but it's very important to understand that you're trying to demonstrate that the schools and the community you've chosen have a high need for talent search services. What do I mean by that? This is the section where you're not trying to brag about how great your schools are and how great your community is. It's the opposite. This is the section where you say, our community and our schools really need this grant. Otherwise, students are going to continue to underperform whatever group you're comparing them to, right? So this is where you're trying to tell the sob story about how terrible things are, all right? I know that that sounds maybe obvious, but you can't imagine the hundreds and hundreds of grants that I've worked on as a consultant, how many people send me data that shows that their schools are performing better than other schools, or their schools are performing better than the state average. If you do that, you almost will always lose points on this section, because the goal here is to show that the schools that you've chosen are performing worse than your comparison group. And so before you, if you are working with a consultant, and some of you on this call do work with me, before you ever send your data or before you ever put the data into your needs section, you should first look at it and read it and analyze it and say, what are these numbers telling me? Are these numbers saying that our schools look bad in comparison to whatever group I've chose to compare them to? If your school data is better than the comparison group you've chosen, you're going to lose points. It's as simple as that, okay? So what data are they asking for? There are 6 sections of the need, and subsection 1 is they want you to outline that there's a high percentage of low-income families in the target area, and you can use census data for that, and you can also use free and reduced lunch data. They give you the option to do one or the other. It says or in the instructions, right? The high percentage or high number of low-income families in the target area, or a high percentage of free and reduced lunch in the target schools that you've chosen. Even though they say or, most people are going to do both, because I think most people are concerned that they're going to not get all the points if they don't do both. And while it's not required, the readers are most likely going to see a lot of applications where people do include both of those things. And so I would recommend doing both as well, because if a reader looks at 7 applications that include both and yours comes and you only have one, they may overthink it and think you did not include everything that you need to include. And it's possible you could lose points just because they're comparing you to other grants they've read. And so, again, while the instructions say or, I recommend doing an and here and including both free reduced lunch rates and low-income families in the target area through the census data. The second section is low persistence rate. So just as it says, they want you to show that the students in the target schools have a low rate of persistence. Very straightforward. The same for number 3, which is low 4-year graduation rate. And number 4, low enrollment and low completion of college. So in number 4, they want you to include that there's a low percentage of students graduating from your target high schools that are enrolling in college. And they also want you to include data that shows that there's a low percentage of adults in your target area between 18 and 24 that are below a baccalaureate degree. Again, you can get that from the census. So they want both college enrollment rates of high school seniors graduating, and they also want baccalaureate degree completion rates of the adults in your target area. One of those should come from your target schools, right? The college enrollment rates of this high school graduating seniors. The other one can come from the census. Number 5, this one is interesting the way they word it, because they talk about the lack of resources and support and coursework available to students in the target area for taking a rigorous curriculum. While they don't specifically ask for the percentage of students who graduate having completed a rigorous curriculum, you do need to volunteer that information because it is one of your objectives. Okay, so you can't just get away with putting in that students don't have enough AP classes or dual enrollment, or they don't have enough rigorous coursework in your area. You must also include the percentage of students who graduate having completed a rigorous curriculum from your target high schools, or you will not have a baseline to write your objective percentage in. So this is a scenario in which the department doesn't ask you for something that you actually need to include, or you won't be able to write a good objective. And we're going to get into that in more detail in the next section about writing objectives. And the last thing here is low academic achievement. And in this section is kind of a hodgepodge of things. They just say they want you to detail low academic achievement of students in the target schools for things like GPA and test scores, student to counselor ratios. They also talk about students who are in foster care or homeless. So you can include a lot of different things in this section, although I would make sure that you include GPA, test scores, and student to counselor ratio. Even though they just give them as examples, I recommend that you include those, at least those 3 things, and some other items as well that you could come up with. So those are the 6 sub-criteria within the needs section. And some sort of overview and tips of this section. You need to identify data that represents the target schools have a need. And so sometimes you may not present data for the entire target school. You may present data like, for example, persistence or graduation rates. You may present data for just students who are on free and reduced lunch, or just students who are low income, or some other subgroup of students within the target schools, because you want to show the most need data you can get. And depending on your geographic area and your target schools, you may have a diverse school population. Now, if you're if you're serving schools that have 100% of your students on free and reduced lunch, or 100% of them are economically disadvantaged, then there's no reason to try to, break the data out into various subgroups, because they're all essentially, in that same group. I mentioned there's 6 sections. The data that we're outlining here, especially with persistence, graduation, college enrollment, college completion, a rigorous curriculum, all of those data points are going to set the baseline for your objectives that we're going to talk about in a second. And they also set in motion the outline that you need to include in your plan of operation for the kinds of things that the kind of problems you're trying to solve. The next thing is you need to use recent data. What is recent data? The Department of Ed says that they want you to use data that's not more than 3 years old. So if you're writing this in 2024 and 2025, you don't want to go back further than 21, 22, 22, 23, and 23, 24 data. Those are the 3 data sets that you want to be looking at. Obviously, 24-25 data is yet to be created, and so you're not going to be able to include this year's data. That's why 23-24 data is going to be the, the newest data that you'll have. You also must include comparison data. So you can't just say your schools are doing poorly because these are their rates. You must also include a comparison group. And the readers typically like to see you comparing to state and national data. Although I know in some states that becomes difficult, where if you're in a state where the state aggregate data is very low, and most of your schools are above your state average on some data points, it's going to be hard to use state data. In that case, you want to use national data. But use state data where possible. If neither of those are going to be compelling for you to show that your schools are underperforming, you're going to want to try to use a comparison group, which may be a more affluent school in the same target area that you're in. So comparing a low performing, high poverty school to a school in your area, in your target area, that's not high poverty, that's not low performing, and do a comparison there. That may be your only option in a case where your state data is so low that it's hard to make a case with the data that you have. We can talk offline about that later, but first try to find state national data as your comparison. Use tables, charts, graphs, and explain them really well. I know that some people, shy away from those, but I think a table is the easiest way to explain to the reader, the kinds of things that that you're trying to show here. So just a simple crude table, right? You've got your percentage, your eligible target schools, your non-eligible group. This is your comparison group. You can compare eligible to non-eligible students within the target schools, as an option as well. But you're gonna have some comparison group here to compare your target schools to. And then you need to put your source down here as well. Do not include current or past participant data, meaning do not say what your rates of success are for your current Talent Search students. Stay away completely from entering any data into your narrative that talks about your existing Talent Search students or your Talent Search students that graduated last year. All right. It's nothing but trouble if you put your existing rates in here. The readers are not concerned about how good your current program is. They're concerned about the state of the target schools that you're putting into your grant now and what their likely outcomes will be if they don't have your intervention. Okay, they're not concerned about the past students that you've had. All right, so only put data from your target schools as it exists now and the comparison group. And I already mentioned use data that's 3 years or less. All right. I'm going to move on to objectives, but anyone have any questions about the need data before we move on? I know I moved very quickly through that, but it's such an important section. And so if you have any questions, please ask them, not only for yourself, but for the good of the entire group. Unless I did that good of a job explaining it. Can we use census tract to define target area? Yes, Jose, you definitely can use census tract. In fact, I think that's probably in some cases the easiest way to do it. Because especially in some cities, you might be in a city that has some very affluent areas and your school location might actually be an affluent zip code, but where your students are coming from, the census tract may actually be a better way to, especially when it comes to things like the adults in the target area with a degree or potentially the low-income families in the target area. So census tract definitely is something you can use. All right. Some of the need data that you can get here: Census Bureau, state national reports and studies, school district data. Your institutional research office might be able to help you, get data. some of the data is going to need to come directly from your school district and your school and or your school sites. I know that in some states, they don't report certain data points, for example, like college enrollment. Some school districts aren't tracking that specifically. And if they are, they don't often do it by low income or non-low income or free and reduced lunch versus non-free and reduced lunch. And so in a lot of cases, you might really need your school sites or your school district to help you dig into some of that data. Especially also if your state data shows something that does not represent what you think is going on with your schools, like dropout rates or persistence rates or graduation rates. You know, oftentimes those are calculated in a different way. And also, I should have mentioned one thing. When we're talking about graduation rates, if you notice here, I put low 4-year graduation rate because the language in the instructions for TRIO programs say that they want to know the percentage of students who graduate in a standard number of years, which is 4 years. So while their graduation rate may be high, you want to find out what the cohort graduation rate is. So of the students who were 9th graders, what percentage of them graduated 4 years later? That's a better marker than just their overall graduation rate. And I think we all know that, you know, the way some schools and districts report dropout rates doesn't always jive with reality, in the sense that, you know, they don't always count all the students who are dropping out or stopping out or went to alternative schools and never finished, and they don't count those students, you know, so there's different things that happen within the data set. And so we want to just try to drill down and dig in as much as we can. Okay, objectives. There are 5 objectives: high school persistence rate, high school graduation rate, high school graduation rate having completed a rigorous curriculum, college enrollment rate, and college completion. We must have a baseline for each one of these, okay? The baseline comes from this data right here, right? The data that we're putting in the needs section, all of these things that we're outlining here become your baseline for each of these objectives, as I've labeled them here in this table. This is really critical. You cannot write an objective without a baseline number. What is the baseline number? The baseline number is the number, or the percentage, I should say, instead of number. It is the percentage of students who are doing that particular thing right now at the target schools. So what is the current high school persistence rate of first-gen low-income students who are free and reduced lunch or economically disadvantaged or whatever defines those students? What is their current persistence rate? What is their current graduation rate? That is your baseline. And then you're going to write an objective that's higher than that. So let's say your current high school graduation rate is 72%. You have to write an objective that's higher than 72%. How much higher? That's where the debate comes in, right? Some people say you need to go at least 10 percentage points higher. Some people say that's too high, you know, so there's no like silver bullet, you know, blueprint for exactly how you write the objectives. But this is something that people consult with us on all the time because this is really critical. We will help you look at things like your baseline, your comparison group. We'll look at your APR data to see how high or low to set it. So there's a way in which we can find a sweet spot to write these objectives. But the main point here is that you cannot just put a random number in here. You cannot put a number of what you think it should be or could be. You can't put a number in here based on what your performance was last time. You only can write this objective if you first have a baseline number at baseline percentage at which the current students in your target schools are performing. And so ultimately what you're saying is the target school students are performing at this rate, and with Talent Search, we're going to help them go even higher than that, right? And so that's what your baseline is telling them. You can't say to the reader, you know, we think a good graduation rate is, you know, 85%, and then they find out that the current graduation rate is 86%, right? Because then they say, oh, well, you're gonna actually reduce the graduation rate by 1 percentage point, right? So the baseline here becomes the only thing that you can use to make these objectives ambitious. All right. The objectives have to be both ambitious and attainable at the same time. The only thing you have that makes them ambitious is the baseline number for each of these data points. The baseline number for persistence, graduation from with a rigorous curriculum, and college enrollment will likely all come from your state longitudinal data systems or come from your target schools or your target districts. The college completion rate is likely going to come from that census data that shows the baccalaureate degree attainment for adults in your target area that are 18 to 24. The reason for that is most schools are not tracking 6-year graduation rate post high school graduation. So most high schools and most districts can't give you that baseline number. And so the only thing we can use as a proxy is the census data for adults in the target area that are under a baccalaureate degree. That's typically what we will use for that one. These other 4 baselines must come from your district or your state data systems. All right. So then the next question is, well, how do you make it attainable? The only way you can make it attainable is by your plan of operation, your staffing structure, your budget, your community and institutional support. Those are the things that make it attainable. So the ambitiousness comes from being above your baseline percentage. The attainability is because you say, well, we're going to increase graduation rate because we're going to provide these 6 services that are specifically designed to help students graduate at a higher rate, right? You're going to tell them, we will get to the objective we're setting because we've got services that we're deliberately going to put together to ensure we'll meet that objective. That's what makes it attainable. All right. You don't get partial credit for one or the other. It can't be ambitious but not attainable, or they won't give you any points at all. You'll get 0. Meaning you can't put 100% objective in here, because while that is ambitious, they're going to say 100% is likely not attainable, because if only one student doesn't do it, you can't meet that objective, right? So it has to be both. And that's why you have to go above the baseline, but not so far above the baseline or so far above your target, your comparison group, that it'll be seen from the readers as not attainable. You're just trying to impress us with these high numbers, even though we don't think you can attain them. Simultaneously, you can't just go a couple of percentage points above the baseline and have that be attainable, but they'll see that as not very ambitious. You've got to be both, otherwise you get 0. All right. And that's, that's something you really need to think a lot about and work a lot about. And I think is one of the values in what we bring to consulting. We have a question here. Is it necessary to report the number and rate of first-generation students at the school level in the needs section? It doesn't ask specifically for number and percentage or rate, so you don't have to include both, but many people do. And so because of that, you might stand out if you don't include both the number and rate of eligible students in your target section. So Jose, I do recommend including both, unless one or the other is going to make you look really bad. Like maybe you have 400 students in a school that are on free and reduced lunch, but maybe you're at a high school with 4,000 students, and so that doesn't look like a very high number, right? 10% of the overall population. So, without looking at your data, it's hard for me to advise you on if you should include both or not. But most applications that I work on, I see people want to include both, just out of fear, again, that they're not going to be adequate enough. All right. The standard for all programs of each of these objectives can be found on your program profile sheet. So while the regulations do tell you that these are your objectives, the program profile sheet in the application instruction package will give you the exact language that you need to include in your objective section. You must copy it word for word. Okay, so the objective language from your program profile sheet has to be identical. All right, so don't just use your old grant. If you're renewing this, go and look at that program profile sheet and make sure it's the same. Most of the time it's the same from the previous application, but sometimes there's language that will change it. So make sure you go look at that program profile sheet. All right. Any questions about the objectives first before we move on? Did I cover that well? I'm sorry, did someone unmute to ask? Okay. So the plan of operation. This is worth the most points, but this is where you as a program director, advisor, coordinator, counselor, whatever your positions are, this is what you know best. You know how you want to run your program, what makes it successful. You know what you need to do to meet your objectives. And so this is where you bring in the most value to your application. And there are 6 sections. Section 1 is how are you going to let everybody know, the community, the schools, everybody know about the goals and objectives of your project. Essentially, how are you going to market your project to everybody so you can get a large number of students to participate? After you market to everybody, right, and tell everyone about your program, how are you then going to identify, recruit, and select the students who will eventually qualify and be able to participate in your program? Once you've identified and selected those students, how are you going to assess their need and deliver services to them? Number 4, how are you going to work with the schools to ensure that students are taking a rigorous secondary school program of study or rigorous curriculum? And then how are you going to administer the project? You know, the timeline of key elements of your project. How are you going to manage it? And then the last one is how are you going to track your participants after they graduate from high school? What's important about this section is that the readers want an actual plan. They don't want you to say, we're going to do this one thing, right? They take the word plan very literally. And so anytime you see the selection criteria says a plan for this, they want that plan to be fleshed out. Who's going to do it? What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? Why are you doing it, right? What objective is that tied to? Everything that you do should look like a plan, in so much that if someone else comes in as a new director or a new staff person, they could read your grant application and they could plan these things out too, because you've given them the details of how it's going to work. So where most people will get all the points on their plan of operation, but the ones that don't get all the points here are the ones that fail to create a plan. They fail to put in some of these details about who, what, when, where, why, how kinds of questions. So again, when you see the word plan, make sure that you read it and write it as a plan. Number 3, don't take anything for granted. A lot of times we leave key elements out of our plan of operation because we've been doing it so long that it becomes second nature to us and we take it for granted. The readers don't know that that's what you're doing. So quite often when I'm consulting with people, I will read through their plan of operation and I'll say, but don't you do college tours? Oh yeah, we do 3 college tours a year. Well, why didn't you include that? Oh, I just totally forgot about it. You know, that's a silly example, but it's just an easy example to think about, right? Oh yeah, we do FAFSA nights. We have, you know, FAFSA counselors come, you know, financial aid counselors coming in from all the different schools, and we do this big FAFSA night. We didn't put that in there, right? So don't take for granted the things that you do. Make sure that you're reading your plan of operation the way you're actually running it. Okay? And so that you don't leave out things that are really key. Number 4, make sure you're addressing your objectives. So you should have a table or chart that shows each of the 5 objectives and which services are designed for those objectives. Because remember, you're putting that under attainability in your objective section. You're saying we can obtain objective 4 because we provided these 5 services for that. If you don't include that in your plan of operation, they're not going to see what you're talking about in your objectives. This is a way that you link each of your sections together. They should not be written independently. There should be a flow to it that says, here's the data that shows that we need this grant and all the problems that students have. These are the objectives that we're going to write because of that data. And these are the services we're going to do in order to meet those objectives, right? There should be a flow to it. This is where you develop your service delivery model. Make sure you include the required services. The required services are outlined in federal regulations. It's connections to high quality tutoring. It's assistance with course selection. It's assistance with college admissions and financial aid and scholarships. It's assistance with financial literacy and assistance with enrolling in college, right? So there's 5 required services specifically for Talent Search. Make sure you include all of them, and also include any additional optional permissible services that you're also providing. Number 7, recommend a scoring rubric. When you're identifying and selecting participants, make sure that you have an objective process, meaning that you have some kind of scoring system to rate students based on their application when you're accepting them into the program. That's not in regulation. You won't find it in the selection criteria. You won't find it in the instruction package. But time and time again, I will see readers deduct points for not having some formalized plan, objective scoring process for your applicants before you accept them into your program. I don't know why they always deduct points for that, but they do quite often. So make sure you have that in there. Applicant community support is pretty straightforward. You just need to get commitment from your institution, facilities, which is your office space, desks, computers, phones, everything to run your program, equipment and supplies, any personnel from the institution that will dedicate some of their time, to your program without being paid. Things like a financial aid counselor doing a financial aid workshop, or admissions counselor doing a college tour or something. And then you also need written commitments from your partners. If you're an institution of higher ed, you need commitments from community-based organizations and or schools within your community. If you're a high school, you need letters from institution of higher ed and nonprofits. And if you're a nonprofit, you need a higher ed partner and some target schools to provide commitments to you as well. Here's another one where you don't want to take things for granted. A lot of people get a lot of in-kind support from various partners, from schools, community agencies, grocery stores, all kinds of stuff. Make sure that you include all that stuff in here. You do need to get signed letters of these commitments, because you're going to say in the application that you do have these signed letters. These letters do not go in your grant application, but instead you're supposed to keep them on file in your office in case you're audited. So this one I think is pretty straightforward, but if there are any questions about this one, please let me know. Most people can get all the points on this one. It's very hard to lose points here, as long as you cover each of these items. Typically recommend tables to reduce text and space here as well. Quality of personnel, there's a section for the director, there's a section for other staff qualifications, and there's a section to plan to employ someone who's overcome similar obstacles as participants. These qualifications are minimum qualifications to hire these positions. Do not write the qualifications for people that are already in the positions or in those roles. You're writing these positions, thinking about how you would fill any openings, right? They're minimum qualifications. Oh, Angela has a question in the Q&A. What would in-kind support at a school look like? The in-kind support at a school would be mostly space and time and access to students and their records. You need to be able to function and run your program out of their school. So any kind of office space they could give you, any kind of classroom space, either during or after school or on weekends, any kind of, anything that will help you run your program at their school would be in-kind support. Space is the premium, but also, access to student records is really, really critical. So that's what I would include in there as well. Some kind of data sharing agreement. So the key to this is that you need to include the degree the person holds, associates, bachelor's, master's degree, what is required, what is preferred. You also need to include the fields of study that those degrees are in. If you don't include fields of study, you most likely will lose points. So education, higher ed administration, public administration, counseling, advising, anything related to, to talent search program objectives. Those would be the fields of study you'd be looking for. You also need to include the years of experience in working in similar kinds of projects. So again, the degree required, the fields of study, and their experience in working in these programs. You need those three things. The plan to employ someone. Remember I said earlier, when they see the word plan, they take it very literally. That's the same here as well. This is a plan to employ somebody. This is a strong statement. They literally want you to go out and find somebody and hire them who have overcome similar obstacles as your participants, right? A TRIO alum, someone who has a TRIO-like background. They're not saying advertise in these places or give somebody a chance to interview. They're saying they want you to find a way to go out and employ these people. So the language literally says plan to employ. And the only time I see people miss points on this section is in subsection 3, where they don't actually have a plan, a step-by-step, how they're going to go find, recruit, interview, ask questions about their backgrounds, and try to actually hire these people. Okay, thanks, Jennifer. We're almost done. The budget here, the budget is outlined for you in the selection criteria. It is a 1-year budget only your first year. If it's included in your plan of operation or your personnel section, it should be in your budget. Let me give you an example. In the last competition, I had a client I worked with that had a tutoring program. And while they did say that the tutors were volunteers, they did not put any tutoring in their budget. And the readers took a point off because they said, well, how can you do tutoring without any money in your budget? The readers were wrong because they did say they were volunteer tutors, but you should put those staff, any staff working on your program, you should put in your budget, even if they're in kind, even if they're volunteers, even if they're paid for by someone else. It's important that you reflect your plan and your personnel in your budget, no matter how they're being paid for, so the readers don't make that mistake. If you say you're going on a college tour, the college tour should be in your budget or they're going to take points off, right? So anything in your plan of operation that costs money or any personnel you should have in your budget, no matter how they're being paid for. All right. In the past RFP in 2021, the maximum we could write for was $277, and there was a $555 cost per participant for a minimum of 500 participants. We don't know if that's going to be the same, but that's what we saw last time. All right. Again, we're almost done here. I know we're going a little over on time, but I'm trying to work through most of this. The evaluation section should be appropriate for project objectives. So you should include your objectives. You should do quantitative and qualitative measures. And you should also do formative and summative types of evaluation. Formative means that you're tracking progress towards meeting your objective so that throughout the year, you know if you're on track to meeting it or not, that you're not just waiting until the end of the year to find out you did not meet your objective. That's summative evaluation. Summative is the end of the year kinds of things like APRs and other kind of reports. Formative is you're measuring your objective throughout the year. So very important. And then disclosure of unintended outcomes. Again, they also want an evaluation plan. So who's going to do the data collection? How often are you going to analyze the data, right? What data pieces, what data tools are you going to use, right? They want you to give a plan of how you're actually, going to do your evaluation process. A table is a pretty good way to do that. Some odds and ends. Last time we had a 65-page limit. I do expect that to be similar. They'll also give you formatting requirements. I will say, though, that page limits are only a recommended page limit. And I have personally worked on applications that have gone over the page limit and they have been funded. So you will see in the RFP instructions that they will say recommended page limits or recommended formatting requirements. You cannot lose points for submitting 66 pages. You cannot lose points for single spacing something that's supposed to be double spaced. That's old. You no longer can lose points for those reasons. I know it's scary to think about that, and everybody wants to adhere to the instructions, and you should adhere to the instructions, but you no longer have to worry that you'll lose points for them. There's a one-page abstract that's single space, and they typically want you to include your project objectives, as well as they want you to indicate which of the competitive preference priorities you plan to write for, which, as I told you earlier, should be all of them. You should never not apply for them. The table of contents does not count in your page limits. You need, if your institution or your nonprofit agency or your school system has not recently applied for a grant in the last 12 months, or will not be 12 months by the time you submit this grant, make sure that your SAM registration is up to date and your workspace is set up, ready to go so that you can apply for this without any problems. There's an appeal process for unsuccessful applicants. If you find out that you're in the second funding band, and you can appeal, please contact me or COE right away. We can help you through that process, but you have to do it immediately because there's usually only 15 days. All right. These are some frequently asked questions that I get all the time. There's 12 of them here. I'm sure there's many others. I'm going to open it up for Q&A. If you want me to answer any of these questions, or you have any questions of your own, or you want to contact me after this webinar to ask questions, I'm going to give you my email address in the chat box. Please feel free to ask any questions that you have now. Otherwise, I will email you all out. Are there any other pressing questions now, or any of these 12 questions resonate with any of you? Yes, if you signed up for this webinar through email, I will email it to you. Otherwise, my email address is in the chat box. Please feel free to send me an email requesting this presentation, and I will email it to you right away. I know I went over by 5 minutes or so, but again, I'm willing to stay on and answer more questions if anybody would like to. Again, here's my email address. Feel free to email me anytime. Otherwise, you're free to carry on for your day, and I hope you guys, have a great day, have a great rest of your week, and please contact me if you need anything.